Long before the world knew his name, a boy came into life in a house that smelled of linseed oil and old books. The year was 1908, the place was Madison, Wisconsin, and the house stood on a quiet tree-lined street not far from the university campus. In the front parlor his mother, Althea, would set her easel by the big window, letting the morning light fall across the canvas as she painted. The baby, John, lay in a bassinet nearby, wrapped in a soft white blanket. There was no hurry in that house, only the gentle rhythm of a clock on the mantelpiece and the distant sound of bells from Bascom Hall drifting across the lake on a spring breeze. The Bardeen home was a modest but gracious place, with dark wood trim, lace curtains, and a porch that looked out toward Lake Mendota. In summer the lake shimmered like a sheet of hammered silver, and in autumn it reflected the red and gold of the maples that lined the shore. John's father, Charles, was a quiet-spoken man who served as dean of the university's medical school. He kept long hours, but when he was home he would sit in the leather armchair by the fireplace, reading journals by the soft glow of a lamp. The house itself seemed to breathe a kind of serene intelligence, as if the very walls were steeped in learning and kindness. Althea Bardeen moved through the rooms with the calm grace of someone who saw the world in colors and shapes. She had studied art in Chicago and brought that sensibility into every corner of the house, a vase of wildflowers on the dining table, a sketch of the lake pinned to the kitchen wall, a small watercolor of the garden in summer. She believed that a child should grow up surrounded by beauty, and so the house was always filled with gentle music, the scent of baking bread, and the sound of her paintbrush stroking the canvas. Little John would lie on the rug and watch his mother's hand move, mesmerized by the slow transformation of blank linen into something full of light. Outside, the neighborhood was a patchwork of professors' homes, each with its own garden and wooden fence. The streets were paved with brick and lined with elm trees that formed a green tunnel in summer. Children played quietly in backyards, rolling hoops or catching fireflies in glass jars at dusk. There were no shrieking sirens, no roaring engines, only the occasional clip-clop of a horse-drawn delivery wagon and the far-off whistle of a train. It was a world that moved at a walking pace, where a boy could stand at the edge of the lake and watch the water lap against the stones for what seemed like hours. The lake was a constant presence in John's early life, a body of water so large that on misty mornings you could not tell where the water ended and the sky began. From the shore, he could see the green dome of the university observatory rising on the opposite bank, and sometimes a sailboat would drift by with its canvas glowing golden in the low sun. In winter, when the lake froze solid, families would skate on the polished surface and build little fires on the ice. The sound of laughter carried far across the still air, but even then it was a muted joy, wrapped in scarves and mittens, softened by the hush of snow. Charles Bardeen was a scientist of the body, but he also loved the life of the mind in all its forms. On Sunday afternoons, he would take young John by the hand and walk him up the hill to the university library, a grand building with tall arched windows. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of paper and leather bindings. Sunlight streamed through the high glass, illuminating dust motes floating in the golden shafts. John would sit on the floor between the stacks, paging through books on astronomy or botany, not yet reading all the words, but already entranced by the diagrams of planets and the cross-sections of flowers. It was a temple of quiet wonder, and the boy felt completely at home. Evenings in the Bardeen house drew in early, especially in the winter months. Althea would light the gas lamps and pull the curtains against the cold. The family gathered in the sitting room, where the fireplace crackled softly and the wind murmured in the chimney. Charles might read aloud from a novel, his voice a low, steady hum, while John built small towers of wooden blocks on the hearth rug. No one rushed, no one raised a voice. Outside, the snow fell silently on the frozen lake, blanketing the world in white. Inside, a small boy was growing up in a pool of lamplight, absorbing a love of quiet inquiry that would shape the rest of his life. When John was still very young, his mother's health began to fade, though in those early years it was only a faint shadow. The house remained a place of warmth and soft voices. Althea continued to paint when she could, propped on pillows by the window, while John sat at her feet with paper and pencil, making his own careful lines. She taught him that looking closely at the world, at the curve of a petal, the grain of a wooden table, the way light fell through a glass of water, was a kind of prayer. Those lessons, delivered in barely more than a whisper, sank into the boy's soul and stayed there, as lasting as the lake water lapping on the shore. John Bardeen was not the kind of child who shouted or pushed his way to the front. He was quiet, watchful, with large, serious eyes and a calmness that adults sometimes found unnerving. At school, while other children squirmed in their seats, he sat still and absorbed everything like a sponge. He had a particular affinity for numbers, not just for their neatness, but for the way they seemed to unlock the hidden architecture of the world. By the time he was 8 years old, he was working his way through algebra problems that his older brother's friends found difficult, solving them with the same steady patience he brought to untangling a fishing line. His elementary school was a short walk from the house, a red brick building with big windows and a bell that rang at 8:30 in the morning. The classrooms smelled of chalk dust and freshly sharpened pencils. John's desk was near the window, and when the lessons were slow, he would gaze outside at the oak tree in the schoolyard, watching the patterns of light shift across its leaves. But even when his eyes wandered, his mind was still working, turning over a math problem or wondering why the sky was blue. Teachers noticed that something unusual lived behind that placid face, a depth of concentration that was rare in a child so young. At home, his father recognized the boy's gift and made sure it was fed. He brought home books from the university library, introductory texts on physics, chemistry, and geometry, and left them on the hall table where John would find them. It was never forced, never formal. John would pick up a volume, carry it to the sunny corner of the porch, and lose himself for an afternoon. The pages were filled with diagrams of levers and pulleys, with tables of elements and the orbits of planets. The world inside those books seemed to be constructed of pure reason, and John found that deeply reassuring. There was a calm order to it, a sense that everything had an explanation waiting to be uncovered. Madison itself was a city that cherished learning, and the university was its beating heart. On Saturdays, Charles sometimes took John to the physics building, a grand stone structure with hallways that echoed with footsteps. Inside, the laboratories were kept dim, lit only by the green-shaded lamps on the work tables. There were glass cases filled with coils of copper wire, brass instruments with calibrated dials, and vacuum tubes that glowed faintly orange. John would stand with his nose pressed to the glass, utterly absorbed. He did not need to touch anything, just looking was enough. The quiet hum of electricity, the faint smell of ozone, these sensations told him that he was in the presence of something profound. When John was 9, his mother's health grew worse and the house became quieter still. Charles hired a nurse to help, and the family moved through the rooms on tiptoe. During this time, John's studies became not just a pleasure but a refuge. He could retreat into the orderly world of numbers and logic, where everything balanced and nothing hurt. He worked through high school mathematics on his own, sitting at the kitchen table late into the evening, his face lit by the soft glow of an oil lamp. The scratching of his pencil was the only sound. Outside, the lake lay still and black, dotted here and there by the lights of a few fishing boats. The Madison public schools allowed him to skip ahead, and by the time he was 12 he was attending classes at the University High School, a laboratory school that was part of the university. The building was modern and flooded with light, with wide corridors and a science wing that seemed to John like heaven. Here he encountered real laboratory equipment, microscopes, spectroscopes, even a small Van de Graaff generator that made his hair stand on end when he touched it. His teachers were graduate students who spoke to him not as a child prodigy, but as a junior colleague. They appreciated his patient way of asking questions, his habit of staring into space for a full minute before giving an answer, as if he were first letting the problem settle. Outside the classroom, John remained a boy of simple pleasures. He loved to fish in the streams that fed into Lake Mendota, standing knee-deep in the cool water with a bamboo pole, watching the light ripple across the pebbled bottom. He collected rocks and sorted them by color and texture, arranging them on his windowsill in careful patterns. On hot summer afternoons, he would lie in the hammock under the big maple tree in the backyard, reading a book on radio transmission or the properties of crystals. The hum of bumblebees among the clover and the distant drone of a motorboat on the lake blended into a gentle soundtrack for his thoughts. By the time he reached his teenage years, the pattern of his life was set, a quiet rhythm of study, observation, and inner reflection. He did not seek attention or applause. He simply followed his curiosity wherever it led. The great technological leaps that would later define his name were still decades away, but the foundation was already being laid in those calm Wisconsin years. He was learning patience, the art of sustained attention, the discipline of sitting with a problem until it yielded its secrets. In a world that was already beginning to speed up, John Bardeen was learning how to stay still and listen. At the age of 15, too young to drive but old enough to know the periodic table by heart, John Bardeen enrolled as a freshman at the University of Wisconsin. In most young men that might have bred a certain arrogance, but John showed none. He still wore the same simple button-down shirts and walked with the same unhurried gait. The campus felt like a second home. He had been wandering its paths since he could walk. The familiar university buildings, the oaks and maples that line the walkways, the glimpse of the lake at the end of every hill, all of it wrapped around him like a well-worn coat. He did not arrive with fanfare. He simply slipped into the stream of students like a leaf falling onto the surface of a pond. His days took on a steady rhythm. Mornings were for lectures in the great lecture halls, where the morning light streamed through tall windows and fell across rows of wooden seats. The professors, mostly men with soft voices and chalk-dusted sleeves, spoke of electromagnetic fields and thermodynamics with a reverence that bordered on poetry. John sat near the middle, not too close to the front, taking notes in a small, precise handwriting. Afternoons he spent in the library, a cavernous room with a vaulted ceiling and the smell of old paper. He would spread his books out on a long oak table and work for hours, the only interruption the soft turning of pages from other scholars scattered around the room. Outside the classroom, Madison offered gentle diversions. Spring brought the first buds to the cherry trees on Observatory Hill, and students would spread blankets on the grass and read in the sun. John often joined them, though he was just as likely to be found sitting on the stone wall by the lake, watching the crew team slice through the water with their long oars. The rhythmic splash of the oars, the coxswain's muffled commands, the glint of afternoon light on the wetwood, these were the sights and sounds of his college years, as much a part of his education as any lecture. He was learning to think in long, unbroken stretches, the way the lake stretched out in front of him, unruffled and deep. His father, Charles, still the dean of the medical school, would occasionally invite John to dinner at the faculty club, a stately building with white columns and a dining room that overlooked the lake. Over meals of roast chicken and mashed potatoes, they would talk quietly about science. Charles would describe some problem in anatomy or physiology, and John would ask careful questions, drawing parallels to physics or chemistry. The older professors at the table would lean in, surprised by the young man's insights. Yet John never pushed himself forward. He waited until there was a natural opening, and then he spoke in that same calm, deliberate tone, as if he had all the time in the world. After finishing his undergraduate degree, John moved east for graduate work, first at Princeton and later at Harvard. The landscape changed from the broad blue lakes of Wisconsin to the narrow, elm-shaded streets of Cambridge. But the inner landscape remained the same. He rented a small room with a window that looked out onto a brick courtyard where pigeons cooed in the morning light. He owned a sturdy desk, a good lamp, a shelf of books, and little else. Each morning he would walk to the laboratory, passing through the iron gate of the campus, hearing the distant chime of the bell tower. The work was hard, the mathematics dense, but John approached it with the same patient dedication a gardener brings to turning the soil. It was during these years that John immersed himself in the mathematics of quantum mechanics, a field that was still young and crackling with new ideas. He worked long into the night, the only light coming from his desk lamp, the rest of the world asleep. When his mind grew tired, He would brew a pot of tea and stand at the window, looking down at the quiet courtyard bathed in moonlight. The silver light on the cobblestones, the faint rustle of ivy on the walls, the distant hoot of an owl, these small comforts sustained him. He was not lonely. He was simply alone with his thoughts, and that was a place he had always found perfectly habitable. Before he could complete his work at Princeton, world events intervened. The country was drifting toward war, and John, like many scientists of his generation, was called to apply his skills to the war effort. He went to work at the Naval Ordnance Laboratory in Washington, D.C., a low brick building set among green lawns and old trees. There he studied the behavior of magnetic fields and the movement of explosives, careful work that took place in quiet offices and dim laboratories. The atmosphere was serious but not frantic. Scientists in white coats moved between workstations, speaking in low voices, their concentration as palpable as the hum of the equipment. It was far from the battlefields, a realm of theory and measurement, and John navigated it with his characteristic steadiness. When the war ended, the world opened up again, brighter and full of possibility. John accepted a position at Bell Telephone Laboratories in Murray Hill, New Jersey, a place that would become the setting for one of the most significant inventions of the 20th century. The campus was a cluster of low brick buildings set on beautifully landscaped grounds, with winding paths, flowering shrubs, and wooden benches where scientists could sit and think. It looked more like a small college than an industrial lab. There was a greenhouse where researchers could take their coffee, and in spring the azaleas blazed pink and white. John moved his family into a modest house nearby, and in the fall of 1945, he walked through the glass doors of Bell Labs for the first time, carrying only a briefcase and a mind full of questions. The solid-state group at Bell Labs was housed in a plain two-story building whose outward modesty concealed the ferment of ideas within. The halls smelled of warm vacuum tubes and machine oil, a faintly metallic scent that clung to one's clothes. John Bardeen shared an office with a handful of other physicists, but the real work happened in the laboratory down the corridor. It was a long room with large windows that let in the gray winter light of New Jersey. Metal tables lined the walls, covered with oscilloscopes, signal generators, coils of wire, and glass speakers of various sizes. At the center of it all sat a contraption that looked like a clumsy sculpture, a slab of germanium crystal, a plastic wedge, a tiny spring, and a gold foil contact shaped by steady hands. Bardeen was not the only mind at work in that laboratory, but he was the one who held the theoretical key. Across the table worked Walter Brattain, an experimental physicist with a gift for building things that were almost impossibly delicate. The two men could not have been more different in style. Brattain was talkative and animated, Bardeen quiet and still, but they shared a deep respect and an easy rhythm. They would stand side by side for hours, Bardeen peering at the equations on his notepad, Brattain adjusting a wire by 1/1000th of an inch. The air between them was not charged with competition, but with a shared, patient curiosity. They would sometimes go for long stretches without speaking, the only sounds the hum of the equipment and the scratch of a pencil. The problem that occupied them was one of the age: how to control the flow of electrons in a solid material in order to amplify a signal. The existing technology, the vacuum tube, was bulky, hot, and fragile, a glass bulb full of glowing filaments that burned out like light bulbs. A solid-state amplifier, if it could be made, would be smaller, cooler, and far more reliable. But the physics of the semiconductor surface had proved maddeningly elusive. For months the team had pushed against a wall of unexpected results. Yet Bardeen's calculations pointed toward an answer. The electrons were trapped at the surface, forming a barrier that could be pierced if one knew exactly how to reach it. The breakthrough came in mid-December of 1947, but there was no explosive moment of discovery, no flask crashing to the floor, no shout of "Eureka!" Instead, on the afternoon of December 16th, Brattain carefully assembled the apparatus according to Bardeen's latest theory, lowering a gold contact down onto the germanium sample. He and Bardeen stood shoulder to shoulder, looking at the oscilloscope screen. The green trace flickered, then jumped. The signal coming through was stronger than what went in. It was amplifying. They both stared at the glowing line for a long time, absorbing what it meant. Then, in the quietest possible way, Bardeen said, "Let's try it again." They did, and the result held. The point-contact transistor had come into being. The next few days were a kind of hushed miracle. Bratton would methodically build more copies, each one a tiny forest of bent wires and shining crystals, while Bardeen scribbled notes and double-checked the theory. Word traveled quietly through the halls, no shouts, only low conversations in doorways. Senior colleagues were invited to witness a demonstration, and they came shuffling into the laboratory on a gray winter morning, still in their overcoats. They watched as a voice picked up by a microphone was amplified 1,000-fold and played through a speaker, the sound crisp and clear. The old men nodded slowly, one by one, as if witnessing a quiet change in the grain of the universe. When the transistor was finally unveiled to the public in the summer of 1948, the press conference was held not in a grand auditorium, but in a small room at Bell Labs headquarters. Bardeen stood at the back, saying almost nothing while others spoke. The news rippled outward, but even many newspapers did not grasp the magnitude of what had been achieved. To the world, it was just another laboratory curiosity. To the men and women at Bell Labs, however, it was obvious that a door had swung open. A single transistor could do the work of a vacuum tube while fitting on the head of a pin, and it gave off no heat, no light, no sound, just a silent, invisible amplification that would, in time, change every aspect of modern life. Yet in the quiet aftermath, tensions began to simmer beneath the surface of the team. Another physicist, William Shockley, had been working on a different approach, and he felt the credit had not fairly included his own contributions. The friction grew, mostly in silences and closed-door meetings, rather than in shouting matches. Bardeen, who valued harmony and concentration above all, found the atmosphere increasingly difficult. The laboratory, once a place of peaceful collaboration, began to feel like a room where the air had gone stale. He did what he had always done when the world grew noisy. He looked for a quieter corner. In 1951, he accepted a professorship at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign, a land-grant school surrounded by endless prairie, and he left Bell Labs behind without fanfare. Before he departed, however, there was one quiet afternoon that stayed with him. It was late spring, and the azaleas outside the lab were in full bloom. Bardeen sat on a wooden bench near the greenhouse, alone, looking at the flowers. A light breeze stirred the branches, and petals drifted onto the grass. He thought about the tiny germanium crystal, about the way the electrons had danced and then, finally, obeyed. He did not feel triumphant. He felt the deep satisfaction of a puzzle solved. The world would soon learn what a transistor could do, but for now there was only this, the soft fragrance of flowers, the warm sun on his face, and a mind at rest. The train that carried John Bardeen and his family west from New Jersey rolled through the green hills of Pennsylvania and then out onto the flat, open lands of Ohio and Indiana. By the time they crossed into Illinois, the landscape had stretched into a vast quilt of corn and soybean fields, dotted here and there by farmhouses with silver silos. The winter wheat was just beginning to show, a pale green shimmer under the April sun. It was a quieter world than the one they had left, softer in its colors, slower in its rhythms. Bardeen looked out the window and felt something loosen in his chest, a tension he had been carrying since the transistor years finally beginning to seep away. The town of Urbana greeted them with broad, tree-shaded streets and the gentle hum of a college town in spring. The campus of the University of Illinois was larger than Madison's, with impressive red brick buildings and a central quadrangle where students lay on the grass between classes. The family moved into a comfortable frame house on a street called Pennsylvania Avenue, a few blocks from campus. It had a big front porch, a deep backyard with an apple tree, and a quiet study on the second floor where Bardeen could close the door and think. In the evenings, the sound of the carillon from Altgeld Hall floated across the neighborhood, marking the hours with stately calm. Bardeen's office in the physics building overlooked a small courtyard where a single oak tree grew. The building itself was old, with wide staircases and creaking wooden floors, but it was filled with light. He furnished his office simply, A wooden desk, a blackboard that covered most of one wall, a few filing cabinets, and a comfortable chair. Books filled the shelves, texts on quantum mechanics, electromagnetism, statistical physics. The blackboard soon became the canvas on which he painted his thoughts, a constantly shifting diagram of arrows, mathematical symbols, and careful schematics. He would stand before it for hours, a piece of chalk in his hand, adding a line here, erasing a term there, his body still as stone while his mind raced forward. Teaching, too, brought him a quiet joy. He was not a showman in the lecture hall. His voice was soft, sometimes so soft that students in the back rows had to strain to hear. But what he said was always clear, always precise. He would walk to the blackboard and sketch a problem, his handwriting small and neat, explaining each step as if he were thinking aloud. The students soon learned that the unassuming man in the front of the room was one of the most important physicists in the world. Yet he never mentioned his own achievements. When someone asked about the transistor, he would smile and change the subject. He was here to look forward, not back. The problem that now occupied his deepest attention was one that had puzzled physicists for nearly half a century: superconductivity. Certain metals, when cooled to temperatures near absolute zero, suddenly lost all electrical resistance. A current started in a loop of superconducting wire would flow forever, never losing energy. It was a phenomenon both beautiful and strange, and no one could explain why it happened. The existing theories were incomplete, like maps with large blank spaces marked "Here be dragons." Bardeen saw those blank spaces and felt the old itch of curiosity. He believed that with the right approach, the secret of superconductivity could be uncovered, and he set out to do so with the same patient persistence he had brought to the transistor. For the first year, he worked almost entirely alone, filling blackboard after blackboard with equations. The work was deeply theoretical, dense with mathematics, but his daily life remained simple. In the mornings, he would walk to campus along streets lined with blooming magnolia trees. At noon, he would eat a sandwich at his desk, looking out at the courtyard oak. In the late afternoons, he would return home and spend an hour in the garden, pulling weeds or pruning the rosebushes. After supper, he might read a novel in the living room, the lamplight warm on the pages. If an idea struck him, he would quietly excuse himself, climb the stairs to his study, and work until the rest of the house was asleep. It was a life that moved at the speed of thought, unhurried and deep. The prairie landscape mirrored this tempo. In every direction, the land rolled gently toward the horizon, unbroken save for the occasional line of trees along a creek. Sunsets were long and spectacular, vast washes of orange and pink that filled half the sky. On weekends, Bardeen would sometimes take his family for drives into the countryside. They would pass through small towns with white clapboard churches and grain elevators standing tall against the sky. The car radio played soft jazz or classical music. He would point out a hawk circling over a field, or the way the light caught the edge of a silo, and then fall back into a comfortable silence. In the summer of 1955, Bardeen stood on his front porch on a hot August evening and watched a thunderstorm roll in across the prairie. The sky turned a deep blue-gray, and lightning flickered along the horizon like the pulsing of a nerve. He thought about electrons, about the way they moved through a metal lattice, how they scattered and then, at a critical temperature, suddenly paired up and flowed without effort. The answer was still somewhere out beyond the edge of his equations, but he could feel its shape. He was not a man who believed in sudden flashes of inspiration. He believed in slow, steady pressure, the kind that wears down stone. He turned back inside as the first drops of rain began to fall, closing the screen door softly behind him. The big breakthrough did not come all at once. It came in stages, over the course of 1956 and early 1957, like a landscape slowly emerging from a lifting fog. By this time, Bardeen was no longer working alone. He had been joined by two collaborators, each adding a vital piece to the puzzle. Leon Cooper, a young postdoctoral researcher with bright eyes and a quick smile, had shown that electrons in a superconductor could form bound pairs under certain conditions. Robert Schrieffer, a graduate student who seemed almost too modest to be a physicist, sat one day on a subway platform in New York and scribbled down a mathematical expression that suddenly made everything fit. That scrap of paper, covered in a student's neat handwriting, became the key that unlocked the whole theory. Back in Urbana, the three men gathered in Bardeen's office around the blackboard. It was late winter, and the bare branches of the courtyard oak tapped against the window when the wind blew. Bardeen stood with his chalk, Cooper leaned against the bookshelf, and Schrieffer sat on the edge of the desk. They had all seen the new equation, and they were trying to understand just how deep it went. Bardeen asked a quiet question, Cooper offered a thought, Schrieffer traced a diagram in the air with his finger. The conversation was soft, almost murmurous, punctuated by long silences as they each retreated into their own minds. Outside, the sky was the color of pewter, and a few snowflakes drifted past the window. Over the following weeks the theory took shape, layer upon layer. The notion at its heart was so elegant that it seemed almost inevitable in hindsight. Electrons, which normally repelled one another, could, within the crystal lattice of a superconductor, feel a subtle attraction. They joined together in what would later be called Cooper pairs, gliding through the metal without the slightest friction. The mathematics that described this collective dance was intricate, but the physical picture was one of exquisite simplicity. Bardeen often compared it to a great crowd of people moving in perfect synchrony, like a flock of starlings at dusk, each bird responding only to its nearest neighbors, yet the whole flock wheeling as one. In April the weather began to warm, and the work entered its final phase. The three men were now writing a series of papers, the longest and most detailed of which would come to be known simply as BCS, Bardeen, Cooper, Schrieffer. They worked in a room with tall windows that they kept slightly open, so the scent of wet earth and blooming lilacs drifted in. The typing was done on a heavy manual machine, the keys clacking as Schrieffer, who had the steadiest hands, typed up the equations on special paper. Bardeen paced slowly, reading from handwritten notes, while Cooper looked over the pages as they emerged, nodding slowly. It was a collaborative rhythm as seamless as the electron pairs they were describing. When the final paper was mailed off to the journal Physical Review in the summer of 1957, there was no celebration, no champagne. Bardeen simply went home and took a long walk with his wife along a gravel road west of town. The fields were high with corn, and the air smelled of sun-warmed earth and clover. They walked in silence for a long while, listening to the meadowlarks singing from fence posts. The sun was low and golden, casting their long shadows across the road. It was one of those perfect Illinois summer evenings when the sky seems so big that you feel almost weightless beneath it. Bardeen felt a quiet contentment, not the adrenaline of victory, but the slow, deep satisfaction of a job finished well. The world of physics needed time to absorb the BCS theory, but when it did, the recognition was profound. In the autumn of 1972, 15 years after the publication of the paper, the telephone rang in the Bardeen house on a pre-dawn morning. The Nobel Committee had announced that the prize in physics would be shared by John Bardeen, Leon Cooper, and Robert Schrieffer for their theory of superconductivity. It was the second time Bardeen had won the Nobel Prize in physics, an honor no one else has ever achieved. When the journalists arrived at his doorstep, he received them kindly but with visible discomfort. He spoke softly about the joy of understanding nature, of the privilege of working with brilliant young minds. He did not mention himself if he could help it. The ceremony in Stockholm that December was a formal affair, with white ties and candlelit banquets, but Bardeen, as always, navigated it with a kind of unassuming grace. He stood on the stage in the great concert hall, beneath the blazing chandeliers, and gave a speech that was brief and to the point. He described the long quest to understand superconductivity, the false starts and the moments of insight, and he thanked his collaborators and his family. The audience, accustomed to grandiloquence, leaned forward to catch his quiet voice. His wife sat in the front row wearing a blue dress, and she smiled up at him with an expression of quiet pride. Afterward, in the reception hall, he slipped away to a corner and stood by a tall window, looking out at the snow falling on the frozen harbor, his hands clasped behind his back. What he thought about as he stood there, no one can know for sure. Perhaps he thought about the lake where he had once fished as a boy, the cold Wisconsin water flowing over the stones. Perhaps he thought about the tiny germanium crystal that had started it all, sitting under a point of gold in a quiet laboratory. Or perhaps he simply watched the snowflakes fall, each one unique, each one following a path that was both free and determined, much like the electrons that had danced for him on the page. Whatever it was, he did not share it. That was his way. His discoveries changed the world, but his soul remained that of the quiet boy on the lakeshore, watching the water and wondering why. After the second Nobel Prize, John Bardeen could have withdrawn into a comfortable retirement, touring the world and collecting honors. Instead, he returned to Urbana, to the same office with the courtyard oak, to the same classroom where his voice could barely reach the back row. He was 64 years old, an age when many men think about resting, but Bardeen thought only about what he still wanted to learn. He launched into new areas of research, charge density waves, the properties of quasi-one-dimensional materials that were as deep and complex as any he had ever tackled. The blackboard filled again with equations, erased and filled anew. The work was its own reward. His daily life continued in its gentle, unchanging rhythm. He rose early, always before sunrise, and made himself a cup of black coffee, which he carried to the back porch, weather permitting. There he would stand for a few minutes, looking out at the garden that stretched toward the alley, the tall sunflowers nodding in the morning breeze. In spring the lilacs bloomed purple and white, in autumn the chrysanthemums burned orange and rust. He did not garden with any great skill or ambition. He just liked the feel of soil on his hands, the slow miracle of a seed becoming a plant. After coffee, he would put on a tweed jacket, pick up his worn leather briefcase, and walk the 3 blocks to the physics building. The students who passed through his classes in those later years barely knew of his fame, and he preferred it that way. He taught introductory physics as well as advanced seminars, and he graded papers himself in a small, careful handwriting. Young people found him approachable but distant in a gentle way, like a kind grandfather who sometimes drifted into a long silence. In faculty meetings, he rarely spoke unless asked a direct question, and then his answers were brief and penetrating. His colleagues learned that if you wanted his opinion, you had to ask for it in a quiet moment, perhaps over coffee in the departmental lounge, where the afternoon light fell in long rectangles across the linoleum floor. At home, the Bardeen household was a place of unfussy comfort. His wife, Jane, had a calm, practical nature that matched his own. Together they had raised 3 children in that house on Pennsylvania Avenue, and now the place carried the marks of a long life, the worn spot on the rug by the fireplace, the crayon marks on the baseboard from when the kids were small, the wooden kitchen table where so many meals had been shared. Evenings were quiet. Bardeen would sit in his armchair with a book, his reading glasses perched low on his nose, while Jane knitted a few feet away. Sometimes the radio played softly, a symphony or a baseball game. The windows were open in summer, and the scent of freshly cut grass drifted in from the neighborhood. He remained, until the very end, a Midwesterner at heart. The prairie was in his bones, its long horizons, its patience, its way of holding silence without embarrassment. When he needed to think through a particularly stubborn problem, he would take long, solitary walks out past the edge of town. The gravel roads crunched under his feet, and the sky arched overhead like a vast blue bowl. Red-winged blackbirds swayed on the cattails in the drainage ditches. He would walk for an hour or more, seeing no one, his mind turning the problem over and over until it took on a shape he could hold. Often, by the time he returned home, the outline of a solution would have grown clear, as if the walking itself had done the work. In his final years, the honors accumulated around him like dry leaves: the National Medal of Science, the Lomonosov Gold Medal, the IEEE Medal of Honor. He received them with gratitude, but without fuss, often giving the award money to the university to support young researchers. When asked to reflect on his incredible double Nobel achievement, he would shrug and say he had simply been lucky to work on interesting problems with good people. There was no false modesty in this. It was the plain truth as he saw it. He did not think of himself as a genius, only as someone who was willing to be patient, to sit with a problem longer than most people would. On a mild October evening in 1990, a few months before his death, Bardeen sat on his back porch as the sun went down. The sky was a deep gradient of rose and gold, and a vee of geese flew south across it, their calls faint and mournful. He held a mug of tea in both hands, the warmth seeping into his fingers. The garden was going to sleep for the winter. The tomato vines had yellowed, and the zinnias were brown at the edges. But there was a beauty in the season too, a kind of peaceful acceptance. He thought about the path his life had taken, from the Wisconsin Lakeshore to the labs of New Jersey to this quiet Illinois town. It all seemed, in retrospect, to have a kind of a shape, not planned but simply unfolded. John Bardeen passed away on January 30th, 1991, at the age of 82. The news traveled around the world, and for a few days the man who had avoided the spotlight was remembered on front pages and in television segments. But the truest memorial was quieter. On the campus of the University of Illinois, in the physics building where he had worked for 40 years, a plaque was placed near the entrance. It bears his name and the dates of his life, but nothing about his prizes. Instead, just this: a teacher and a scientist. It is the sort of tribute he would have liked best, simple, honest, and understated. And in the evenings, when the setting sun streams through the tall windows of the corridor, the plaque catches the light and glows softly, like a transistor switching on, like a current flowing without resistance, carrying a man's quiet legacy forward into the gathering dusk.